The Middle Ages? For most of us, it's a time wrapped in mist, a dark and mysterious era. Muddy streets filled with peasants, stone castles towering over the land, cathedrals rising into the sky, and above all, the ever-present shadow of the church. But history is not made only of wars and faith. The hidden sides of people, their passions, desires, and fears, were also an inseparable part of this world. And that's why today we're opening the door to a subject very few dare to talk about: the strangest, most surprising sexual practices of the medieval era. Sometimes they will sound absurd, sometimes disturbing, but remember, all these stories were part of people's struggle to survive, to believe, and to love. To us, they may look bizarre. To them, they were perfectly normal. So let's turn the dusty pages of time together and step quietly into a world shaped by the Church's shadow, full of prohibitions, secrets, and forbidden curiosity. In the Middle Ages, sexuality wasn't a private matter like it is today. Over it stood one of the most powerful authorities of the age, the Church. The Church dictated not only how people should pray, but also when, how, and for what purpose they could be together. To us, this might sound unbelievable. But for medieval people, it was just another fact of daily life. Clergymen defined sex as a duty given by God. People were meant to come together for one reason only: to produce children. Pleasure was not part of the plan. Pleasure was temptation, the devil's game, the gateway to sin, which meant that even in their most intimate moments, ordinary couples still felt the heavy weight of rules pressing down on them. Monasteries produced long lists of sins in so-called penitential handbooks. They spelled out in detail: on which days may you have intercourse? In which positions are you sinful? Which behaviors bring you closer to the devil? The missionary position, in today's terms, was considered the only acceptable one. Anything else was branded as perversion or demonic influence. And the rules didn't end there. The calendar itself restricted intimacy. Sundays were holy days, which meant no sex. Feast days throughout the year, Christmas, Easter, Saints' days, all carried the same prohibition. According to some historians, almost half of the entire year was officially off-limits for married couples. Desire existed, but the calendar constantly said no. Of course, such restrictions created tension. People could not simply bury their desires, and that is when some of the strangest practices began to emerge. A 12th century priest's manual describes a curious method women used to avoid pregnancy. After intercourse, the woman was instructed to sit upside down on the bed while reciting specific prayers. From a scientific point of view, it meant nothing. But in that world, the power of prayer was real. Elsewhere, fertility rituals were practiced with holy water. Priests would bless the water, and women who drank it were believed to conceive more easily. In some villages, after drinking, women had to walk barefoot on the soil, believing the earth's fertility would flow into their bodies. The more the church tried to suppress desire, the more people found alternative ways. In the shadows of prohibition, sexuality became secretive and symbolic. Couples who broke the rules sometimes rushed to confess their sins to a priest, while others kept silent and carried on. The secrecy itself made sexuality even more complex, even more alluring. For the people of that time, all this was deadly serious. What may look laughable to us today, prayers, rituals, forbidden calendars, were for them sacred acts. They were ways to please God, to avoid sin, to protect their families. But from the distance of centuries, we see them for what they are: the strangest and most fascinating sexual practices of the Middle Ages. And this journey has only just begun, because history still holds far more surprising things to reveal. For medieval people, sexuality was not merely a need of the body. It was also seen as a reflection of fate, the heavens, and hidden forces. To guide their desires, they looked up to the stars, listened to the advice of doctors, and carried on strange rituals inherited from ancient traditions. In this world, reason and superstition were woven together. Let's begin with the heavens. In medieval Europe, it was widely believed that the stars and planets had a direct influence over human life. A couple wishing to have children first had to study the sky, the phase of the moon, the position of Venus, even the brightness of Mars. These were thought to determine their destiny. Ancient manuscripts included long lists claiming on which days intercourse would result in a boy and on which days a girl. Some priests condemned these beliefs as heresy, but most ordinary people would not even dare to go to bed without consulting the heavens first. Just as powerful as the stars was medicine. But medieval medicine was nothing like the science we know today. People believed the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health depended on the balance of these fluids. Sexuality was seen as both a friend and an enemy of this balance. On one hand, too much intercourse was said to weaken the body, especially men. Old texts warned that excessive emission would age a man, loosen his teeth, and even shorten his life. Young men were often cautioned, "Give in to your urges, and your days will be numbered." On the other hand, sexuality was also considered essential for good health. Women, it was said, needed regular intercourse to prevent the buildup of toxic vapors in their bodies. Some physicians even believed that if a woman did not experience orgasm, her womb could become damaged. Doctors advised husbands not to neglect their wives because a woman's health depended directly on her husband fulfilling his marital duty. When it came to fertility, things became even stranger. Couples hoping for children were given advice that often defied logic. In one region, women were told to place a small phallus-shaped stone idol under the bed to conceive. Elsewhere, soil taken from a grave was sprinkled near the bed, in the belief that the spirits of the dead would help new life enter the world. In the north, women seeking pregnancy drank special mixtures made from the milk of fertile cows. After drinking, they would pray and walk back to their bed under the moonlight. Sometimes magic blended into these rituals. A manuscript from Eastern Europe describes women wearing dried frogs around their necks to boost fertility. After several days, the frog would be buried, and its spirit was believed to protect the unborn child. In the West, the customs were a little gentler. A bride wishing for a child might leap over sown fields in her wedding dress to draw the fertility of the soil into her body. All these practices varied depending on the community. In towns, the wealthy often followed the church's rules more strictly, but in rural villages, people secretly preserved older pagan traditions. This meant that, at the same time, one town's priest might forbid stargazing, while just a few miles away, peasants gathered under the moon for fertility rites. Contradictions existed not only between the church and the people, but even within the clergy themselves. Officially, astrology was condemned as heresy. Yet some priests quietly whispered to couples the right times, according to the stars. Physicians, too, spoke in contradictions, warning against excess while also insisting on the health benefits of sex. This double language left many medieval people confused. But for them, what mattered was finding some kind of solution. To us, these practices may sound bizarre, but to medieval men and women, they were an ordinary part of life. They truly believed that by watching the heavens, they could shape their children's destiny, that with a blessed drink of water, they could increase fertility. These beliefs gave them comfort, a sense of control in a world full of uncertainty. Centuries later, we read these stories with a smile of disbelief, but also with curiosity. How did all these prohibitions, superstitions, and rituals shape love and desire? While the church tried to restrain them, in what secret ways did ordinary people live out their passions? That is the next step in our journey. In the Middle Ages, love and sexuality were not only matters of desire, they were also matters of law and punishment. for the church sought to control not just souls, but also bedrooms. Rules dictated when, how, and under what conditions people could come together, and when those rules were broken, the consequences were often humiliating and sometimes terrifying. The greatest authority was, of course, the church. It declared that all sexual activity outside marriage was a sin, but it went further. Even within marriage, many acts were forbidden. Couples were not allowed to be intimate on Sundays, during holy days, or in periods of fasting. In some regions, only a few days of the week were permitted for intercourse. For the church, sex existed solely for procreation. Pleasure itself was condemned as sinful. But people did not always obey these rules, and when they were caught, punishments could be severe. Adultery, especially for women, was considered among the gravest sins. In many places, an adulterous woman was forced to wear a sign of shame and be paraded through the streets. Sometimes the word adulteress was branded on her forehead. Sometimes she was chained for all to see. Men, more often than not, received lighter punishments, but women bore lasting disgrace in the eyes of society. In some regions, punishments were far harsher. In 13th century Germany, adulterous couples could be sewn together into a sack and thrown into a river. In France, an adulterous woman might have her hair shaved off and be displayed in the town square. The purpose was not only to punish the guilty, but to warn everyone else. Fear kept society in line, but the church's reach extended well beyond adultery. Any act deemed unnatural was condemned. Masturbation, same-sex relations, and even improper positions between married couples were labeled sins. Monastic manuals listed these acts in shocking detail. For example, intercourse in any position other than the missionary was considered diabolical. Some sources even record that if the man was not on top, the act itself could be treated as a crime because it was thought to defy the natural order. Behaviors linked to lust, magic, or perversion were believed to be signs of direct dealings with the devil. Those accused were dragged before inquisitorial courts. These trials were rarely trials at all. They were nightmares of torture and forced confession, ending most often in burning at the stake. Even ordinary people could fall victim to this oppressive system. Couples who failed to conceive were viewed with suspicion. If the woman was blamed, she could be accused of witchcraft. There are cases of women tortured simply because they could not bear children. Men in this position faced ridicule instead, and some secretly sought fertility spells or charms to protect their reputations. Among the strangest of the church's trials were those for bestiality. Medieval records reveal that such cases were more common than we might expect. Both the accused person and the animal were punished, often executed together. The logic was that anything which corrupted God's order had to be utterly destroyed. Today this seems unimaginable, but to them it was a grim necessity. The church also wielded public shame as a weapon. Sinners were forced to confess their wrongs before the entire congregation. Kneeling at the church door and declaring one's sins for all to hear was, for many, a punishment worse than death. It branded not only the individual, but their family with disgrace. From a modern perspective, these punishments seem cruel and merciless. But to medieval people, they were essential to protect the divine order. Sin was not just a private failing, it was a danger to the entire community. One person's crime could bring down God's wrath on all: famine, plague, or war. To punish the sinner was, in their eyes, to protect everyone, and so love and desire existed in constant tension. People were forced to hide their passions. Fear of punishment silenced them, yet desire could not be erased. No matter how harsh the restrictions, the human heart always found a way, sometimes in the shadows of night, sometimes behind a mask, sometimes in the most unexpected of places. The question is, did all these rules and punishments truly succeed, or did they make passion more dangerous, more secretive, and more irresistible? In the next chapter, we'll explore the hidden world of forbidden love, of secret affairs, desperate obsessions, and desires that defied both law and faith. Some of the most echoing tales in the shadows of the Middle Ages were those of forbidden love and secret affairs. For no matter how strict the rules, the heart could not be chained. People loved in defiance of church law, surrendered to their desires, and left behind stories that were at times romantic, at times scandalous. The most notorious were those that unfolded in royal courts. Kings and queens often married for politics, not passion, yet their hearts wandered. In England, the marriage of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine united a vast empire, but rumors of Eleanor's affairs with young knights spread across Europe. At the same time, Henry's own mistresses were an open secret. These relationships caused not only domestic turmoil but also political crises, for love had the power to undo the cold calculations of royal marriage. It was not only kings, however. Knights, too, often stood at the center of forbidden romances. Medieval Europe cherished the ideal of courtly love. A knight swore loyalty to a noble lady, fought for her honor, and composed poetry in her name. Yet such devotion frequently passed beyond admiration into secret intimacy. The troubadours' songs of passion were not mere fantasies, but echoes of these very clandestine affairs. Among common folk, secret relationships were no less common. Village marriages were usually arranged by families. A woman or man tied to someone they did not love often sought affection elsewhere. A wife might steal moments with a young shepherd, a husband with a woman from a neighboring village. Discovery could bring harsh punishment, yet many risked it still, for the heart would not stay silent. When exposed, the consequences were often dramatic. Gossip spread quickly in small communities. Soon elders or churchmen would intervene. An adulterous woman might be displayed in shame before the entire village, forced to confess her sins. Yet, when the same offense was committed by a man, it was often overlooked or more easily forgiven. This double standard was one of the defining traits of medieval society. Forbidden love was also bound up with magic. Lovers sought to bind the hearts of others through charms and potions. Manuscripts record recipes for love potions made from hair, nail clippings, even drops of blood. These were mixed into wine or food, believed to break the will of the beloved and stir desire. Perhaps the effect was only psychological, but for many, the result was real enough. Love lived in the shadow of sorcery. Some romances were so powerful that they became immortalized in literature and legend. The tale of Tristan and Isolde is among the most famous. Tristan, a servant of the king, falls in love with the king's betrothed, Isolde. Their passion begins with a potion and ends in tragedy. But the story was more than myth. It symbolized the forbidden desires and rebellious hearts of an age bound by rigid rules. Of course, not all secret loves ended in tragedy. Some endured for years, hidden from public view. Some produced children, illegitimate offspring who, in some cases, rose to positions of influence. The bastards of kings and nobles shaped the politics of Europe, even if they were born outside the sanctity of marriage. Perhaps the most striking element was society's hypocrisy. Everyone knew such affairs existed. Songs, folk tales, and legends retold them endlessly. And yet, officially, the church and the law condemned them. Medieval life thus carried a dual existence. By day, obedience to rules. By night, surrender to desire. Today we view these stories with a mixture of fascination and unease. Forbidden love in the Middle Ages was both dangerous and intoxicating. It was not only the story of two hearts, but the reflection of a society caught between desire and prohibition, freedom and control, love and sin. But our journey is not yet complete. For one of the darkest and strangest aspects of the Middle Ages still lies ahead: witchcraft, pacts with the devil, and a world where sexuality itself was seen as a pathway to the demonic. Now we open the door to that fearful and mysterious realm. In the Middle Ages, love was not only surrounded by sin and prohibitions, it was also exalted, seen as a sacred power. For people, love was sometimes a gateway to God, sometimes the source of heroism. That is why the medieval world, while full of dark taboos, also became home to some of the most magnificent tales of romance. One of the most celebrated forms of this exalted love was the tradition of courtly love. Beginning in the 12th century in European courts, this ideal held that a knight should be a hero not only on the battlefield, but also in the battlefield of the heart. His duty was to show loyalty to his lady, to compose poetry for her, to fight with his sword for her honor. This love was often unattainable, forbidden, or purely platonic. But precisely because of that, it was exalted as if it were a divine mission. Troubadours, the wandering poets and singers, gave voice to these passions. From southern France to Italy, from Germany to England, their songs transformed love into something almost religious. In their verses, the beloved woman was not merely human, she was a reflection of the divine. Her eyes evoked paradise, her smile suggested heavenly light. Through these songs, love was not painted as sin, but as a force that could purify the soul. Love was also sanctified in religious texts. Saints and mystics, when describing their devotion to God, often borrowed the language of earthly passion. Saint Bernard described the bond between God and humanity as a marriage of love. Female mystics wrote of visions in which they encountered Christ as if he were a lover. In some mystical experiences, union with God was even compared to an ecstasy akin to sexual rapture. This shows that in the medieval mind, love could be not only sinful, but also a sacred path. Literature, too, magnified this vision. One of the best-known examples comes from Chrétien de Troyes, the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. Lancelot, King Arthur's most loyal knight, falls in love with the queen. Their affair is both sacred and forbidden. Their relationship embodies loyalty and betrayal, sin and sanctity all at once. It is a perfect mirror of the contradictions in the medieval heart. Love was a divine gift, yet also a dangerous trial. The exaltation of love also spilled into daily life. At courtly tournaments, knights displayed not only their strength, but their devotion. Ladies would honor them with a token, a scarf, a handkerchief, a piece of cloth, which the knight would wear on his armor in battle. These small tokens became almost like holy relics of love. Even among common folk, love carried mystical weight. A peasant girl might preserve a piece of bread given to her by the boy she loved, keeping it until it spoiled, because for her it was proof of his heart. Such gestures may seem simple to us today, but in the medieval world, love was truly treated as a sacred relic. Of course, this idealized vision rarely matched reality. For most, marriage remained an economic arrangement. Yet literature and music offered people a different dream. Many young men and women longed to live the love they had heard in troubadours' songs. Thus, forbidden romances often became adorned with romantic ideals. A knight might see his secret affair not as a mere indulgence, but as a duty that purified his soul. This contradictory vision made medieval love unique. On one side, desires were branded as demonic. On the other, love was seen as a path to God. On one side, women were punished in public squares for adultery. On the other, noble ladies were exalted in poetry. On one side, women were accused of consorting with demons. On the other, holy women claimed to marry Christ through love. When we listen to these stories today, we realize the Middle Ages were not monochrome. Their world was one where black and white, sin and sanctity, fear and romance coexisted side by side. And perhaps that is why medieval tales of love still enchant us, because in them we find all the contradictions of the human heart: prohibition and freedom, passion and faith, sin and holiness. But our journey is not over yet. For in the Middle Ages, Love and sexuality were not only lived between men and women, they also intertwined with folklore, supernatural beings, and legendary heroes. And now, we open the door to that mythical world. In the Middle Ages, love and sexuality were not experienced only between people. They also appeared in folk tales, legends, and encounters with supernatural beings. These stories reflected both the fears and the hidden desires of society. For the creatures in these legends were symbols, sometimes of dangerous allure, sometimes of forbidden love. One of the best-known examples was the tales of water nymphs and river spirits. Across Europe, people told stories of female beings who lived in lakes and streams deep in the forests. Beautiful, enchanting, often described as naked, these spirits would appear to men wandering alone at night, inviting them to dance. If the man accepted, he rarely returned. The nymphs would drain his soul, his life force, leaving him to die. Beneath these tales, however, lay a deeper meaning, the fear of sexual desire. A man who gave in to feminine allure was not just approaching sin in society's eyes, he was stepping closer to death itself. Similarly, there were folk versions of the incubus and succubus legends. People believed that strange beings entered their dreams at night to lay with them. Women described them as shadowy nightmares, while men spoke of them as seductresses. Such tales were passed from generation to generation in villages, often as warnings for children. Don't wander alone at night, or the spirits will take you. But love with the supernatural was not always terrifying. In many tales, a fairy or a jinn fell in love with a human and married them. These unions were almost always conditional. The human spouse was forbidden to reveal the fairy's secret or break a sacred rule. And more often than not, the rule was broken. The fairy vanished, and the human was left alone. The message was clear. Breaking taboos leads to the loss of happiness. There were also tales of love in animal form. In medieval folklore, a woman might fall in love with a wolf or a man with a swan. These stories later evolved into Europe's transformation tales. Even the famous story of Beauty and the Beast traces its roots back to the Middle Ages. Such symbolic romances between humans and animals represented the untamed primal side of human desire. Folk practices with love potions and charms also belong to this supernatural realm. Women brewed mixtures of herbs and animal parts to bind a man to their love. Sometimes blood, hair, or nail clippings were added. While these potions may have had little effect beyond psychology, people believed they carried great power. It was said that a man who drank such a potion would never forget the woman who gave it to him. These spells showed that love was sought not only in the heart, but also in unseen forces. Legends also wrapped sexuality in symbols. In some regions, giants were said to lust after human women. Children born of such unions were believed to possess extraordinary strength. Such tales reflected society's views on fertility and power through a fantastical lens. Likewise, women accused of lying with the devil were believed to give birth to children that were half human, half monster. All of these stories mirrored the desires and anxieties of medieval people. For them, love was not confined to the human realm. It reached into nature, into spirits, into the unknown. To a peasant, a shimmering reflection in the water might hide a nymph. To a knight, a shadow in the forest might be the invitation of a witch. When we look at these tales today, we realize they were not just fantasies. They were a symbolic language, a way for people to express forbidden feelings and repressed desires that could not be spoken aloud. Folklore carried what society could not say directly, and perhaps this is why medieval legends still captivate us, because what they reveal is one of humanity's oldest truths, stories born where desire, fear, and imagination intertwine. But our journey does not end here, for now we must turn to the most secretive, the most shameful, and the strangest aspects of medieval sexuality, a shadowed world shaped by prohibitions, punishments, and practices pushed to the very edges of society. In the Middle Ages, the darkest and most taboo aspects of sexuality were shaped not only by prohibitions, but also by practices pushed to the margins of society. Many beliefs and customs that seem strange, disturbing, or unbelievable to us today quietly held a place in daily life back then. For people's desires could not be contained within the narrow limits drawn by the church. The stricter the bans, the more creative, and often bizarre, the ways people found to defy them. The church defined extramarital sex as one of the gravest sins. Yet this prohibition did not stop people from pursuing secret affairs. In many places, relationships with married women were an open secret, known by the community, but never spoken of aloud. Sometimes such affairs ended in tragedy. Women caught in adultery were paraded in public squares, flogged, or even stoned. Men, by contrast, often escaped with lighter punishments. This injustice reveals how sexuality in medieval society was judged differently along gender lines. Even more taboo was homosexuality. In medieval Europe, male relationships were condemned under the name sodomy and punished harshly. The church branded such unions against nature. Yet sources reveal that these relationships were far from rare, especially within monasteries and royal courts. Some kings and nobles even became the subject of scandal due to their intimate ties with male companions. Punishments were severe, burning at the stake, exile, or death. But despite the terror of such consequences, people did not abandon their desires. Prohibitions only forced them further underground. One of the gravest sins of all was bestiality. Those accused of such acts were often executed alongside the animals involved. In village trials, both man and beast were condemned, for people believed that any offspring born of such a union would be monstrous, spawn of the devil himself. These punishments illustrate how far society's fears and taboos could go. Incest was another dangerous frontier. Though marriages between relatives sometimes happened in villages, often for economic reasons, the church fiercely opposed them. Couples caught risked excommunication, but in small communities, where everyone was related in some way, enforcement was nearly impossible. Sometimes priests turned a blind eye. Sometimes bribes changed hands. Once again, there was a constant tension between religious law and everyday reality. Other bizarre practices were legitimized under the guise of healing. For instance, couples struggling with infertility turned to healers and folk magicians for remedies. Some women were told to walk naked through graveyards to gain fertility. Men, meanwhile, were urged to touch phallic-shaped stones. To us, these rituals may seem absurd, yet for medieval people, they were acts of deep belief. Another marginalized group were sex workers. Brothels in medieval towns were both banned and tolerated. City leaders often justified them as a way to prevent greater sins. In fact, in some regions, brothels were openly taxed. It was a striking hypocrisy. While the church damned them, city officials profited from them. There were also stranger practices, rituals blending sexuality with community festivals. In certain rural celebrations, couples were said to engage in open intercourse in the fields to bring fertility to the land. The church condemned these rites with fury. But villagers continued them in secret, seeing the acts not as lust, but as sacred fertility magic. All of these prohibitions, punishments, and hidden practices reveal a clear truth. Sexuality in the Middle Ages was never truly suppressed. The more the church tried to control it, the more people found ways to transgress. What was forbidden became alluring. What was taboo grew larger through rumor and legend. To us, these customs seem extreme, even unthinkable. Yet, when we look closer, they reveal something deeply familiar, that no matter how harsh the restrictions, human beings never completely abandon their desires. They hide them, they reshape them, they find new ways to express them. And now, after this hidden world, we turn to one of the least discussed but most fascinating aspects of medieval sexuality, how men and women perceived their own bodies. For in the Middle Ages, gender was not just biology, it was destiny, spirit, and a symbol of one's very place in society. In the Middle Ages, sexuality was not only an expression of desire, but also a reflection of how the body itself was understood. For medieval people, the male and female body carried not just biological meaning, but also spiritual and social significance. The body you were born with determined not only your desires, but also your destiny. At the core of medieval medicine lay the ancient Greek theory of the four humors. The human body was thought to be governed by the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Personality, temperament, and even sexual appetite depended on which humor was dominant. Women were considered cold and moist, while men were hot and dry. This underpinned the belief that women were passive by nature, while men were active. The same logic applied to sexuality. The man was the actor, the woman the receiver. But it went further. Many medieval thinkers argued that woman was, in essence, an incomplete man. This Aristotelian idea framed the female body as flawed, while the male body was seen as the ideal. Female organs, it was claimed, were merely male organs turned inward. Such a worldview shaped not only medicine, but society itself. Women's desires were treated as less important, and their bodies as more dangerous, prone to sin, and more vulnerable to the devil's temptations. At the same time, the female body was the mysterious center of fertility. Medieval medical texts describe the womb almost as an independent creature. It was believed the womb could wander through the body, sometimes rising up to the throat and choking a woman. To prevent this, doctors claimed that women required regular intercourse, or else the womb would fall ill. In this way, women's bodies were portrayed as perpetually dependent on male intervention. The male body, meanwhile, was imagined as the vessel of strength and energy. Yet this power depended on the preservation of semen. Sperm was considered the very essence of life. Frequent emission was thought to weaken men, even bringing them closer to death. Thus, young men were advised to practice chastity. The loss of semen was not only a physical depletion, but also a spiritual decline. The male body was like a vessel filled with power, but one that had to be carefully guarded. When it came to female desire, medieval thought was riddled with contradictions. On one hand, women were seen as colder and more passive. On the other, many medical texts insisted women were in fact more lustful than men. For conception, it was believed, women had to feel pleasure. Some physicians therefore argued that women possessed stronger sexual appetites than men. This idea split the female image in two: women as objects of desire, but also as sources of sin. This perception fed fears and anxieties about women in society. The figure of the lustful woman emerged, dangerous, allied with the devil, and intent on seducing men. And yet, at the same time, women were revered for their fertility. The figure of the Virgin Mary embodied this paradox to the extreme. The sinless mother set in opposition to the carnal desires attributed to all other women. For men, control of the body was proof of virtue. A man who mastered his desires was considered strong, honorable, and close to God. A man who succumbed was weak, sinful, even enslaved to Satan. Thus, bodily control was not only a private matter, but also a social one. Male restraint meant protecting both soul and family. These beliefs shaped daily life. Women's movements in public were restricted, and modesty of dress was strictly enforced. Men, meanwhile, lived under constant pressure to balance power with restraint. Yet despite all the rules, prohibitions, and fears, desire itself never disappeared. For the body, no matter what meaning was imposed on it, continued to live with its longings. Looking back at these medieval ideas about the body, we see how deeply people struggled to understand human nature. They assigned holiness and sin to the female body, strength and weakness to the male. Sexuality became more than a matter of pleasure. It was a sign of destiny, of the soul, of one's very place in the world. And this is why, to understand medieval sexuality, we must look not only at prohibitions and rituals, but also at the profound meanings attached to the body itself. But our story is not yet complete, for beyond these ideas of flesh and spirit lie the strange and often startling beliefs and practices surrounding birth, fertility, and family life in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, sexuality was not only about pleasure or sin, it was also deeply tied to birth and fertility. For a couple, having children was not just a private matter, but a vital concern for the survival of the community itself. Fertility was seen as the guarantee of life's continuation. To be childless brought immense pressure on both men and women, and this pressure gave rise to strange beliefs and unusual rituals. Infertility was rarely understood as a medical problem alone. If a woman could not conceive, it was often blamed on her sins or her supposed lack of passion. Physicians argued that the womb could only remain healthy through regular intercourse. Some texts even stated that for a woman to conceive, she had to experience genuine pleasure. This meant many husbands felt obligated to ensure their wives' satisfaction. In the medieval worldview, fertility was not only God's blessing, but also the outcome of proper sexual harmony. Couples seeking children turned to countless superstitions. Women were advised to eat fruits seen as symbols of fertility, especially pomegranates and apples. In some regions, women hoping to conceive would walk barefoot to the church doors. Elsewhere, they were told to wander naked through cemeteries at midnight, believing the spirits there could grant them fertility. Men, too, had their own rituals. A man who felt his strength waning might be told to touch stones or carvings in the shape of a phallus. In some villages, men bathed in the blood of rams or bulls, animals long regarded as symbols of fertility and virility. Childbirth itself was surrounded by ritual and superstition. Women were aided not only by midwives, but also by prayers and charms. Beneath the birthing bed, sacred objects were placed, crosses, relics of saints, or cloth soaked in holy water. These were believed to protect the mother and ease her labor. But childbirth could also inspire fear and dark beliefs. In some areas, babies born feet first were seen as marked by the devil. Such infants were considered unlucky, and if they died before baptism, their death was sometimes accepted as a natural punishment. Likewise, women who died in childbirth were thought to become restless spirits, haunting their villages unless special symbols were carved on their graves. Having many children was seen as a blessing from God. Yet even here, contradictions appeared. If a woman gave birth too frequently, it was sometimes taken as a sign that she was overly lustful. Thus, fertility could both elevate a woman and cast suspicion upon her. For barren women, the stigma was severe. A woman who could not bear children was often seen as cursed or bewitched. Some were accused of witchcraft, others were abandoned by their husbands. This shows how closely a woman's worth was tied to her ability to give birth. Male infertility was less often acknowledged, blame usually fell on the woman, though whispers about men's weakness did circulate in secret. All of this reveals that in the Middle Ages, childbirth was never just a biological event. It was also a religious and social moment. Each child represented not only the hope of a family, but also the future of the village itself. Fertility was surrounded by both reverence and fear. Looking back, we can see that these rituals expressed a society's deepest concern, survival. Without children, bloodlines would end, villages would shrink, and fields would lie untended. This is why countless beliefs, some innocent, some unsettling, grew up around birth and fertility. Whatever form they took, they all served one purpose: to keep life going. And now, at the end of this journey, we can begin to see how all these aspects of sexuality in the Middle Ages, desire, taboo, the body, birth, and fertility, fit into the larger picture of society As we've seen, sexuality was never just a private matter. It was interwoven with religion, culture, politics, and the rhythms of everyday life. At the end of our long journey through medieval sexuality, we find that what we have really uncovered is the soul of a society. For sexuality was never merely the meeting of two bodies, it was also the place where faith, fear, prohibition, and hope were woven together. We have seen how the Church, in trying to control sexuality, in fact helped to shape it. It dictated when, how, and for what purpose people should come together. Yet this system of prohibitions did not extinguish desire. It drove it into hidden and often strange expressions. The body became, in the eyes of the Church, a mark of sin. Yet at the same time, it was the source of life and continuity for the community. This paradox left its imprint on every corner of the Middle Ages. Women's bodies were both sacred and dangerous. They were exalted for their fertility, yet feared for their lust, thought to bring them closer to the devil. For men, the body was the vessel of strength. But that strength had to be carefully guarded, forever at risk of being wasted. Birth and fertility brought both hope and dread. Children were seen as God's blessing, yet childbirth itself was shadowed by superstition and the fear of death. Amidst all these beliefs, rituals, and prohibitions, humanity itself remained unchanged, filled with desires, passions, and curiosity. No matter how strict the rules, no matter how heavily sin was branded, people continued to be drawn to one another. For sexuality has always been one of humanity's most fundamental drives, present in every age. Looking back, the strange and unsettling practices of the Middle Ages may strike us as bizarre. But we must remember, they made sense in their own time, in their own reality. Faced with the unknown, people sought ways to cope, sometimes through prayer, sometimes through superstition, sometimes through the most unusual of rituals. Medieval sexuality holds up a mirror. In it, we see not only the past, but also the unchanging nature of humanity. Even today, desire is shaped by prohibitions, by faith, and by society's rules. Technology has advanced, knowledge has grown, yet the search within human nature remains the same. And perhaps this is why exploring the hidden world of medieval sexuality is not merely a historical curiosity. It is also a journey toward understanding the parts of ourselves that never change. As we close this journey, the questions remain. Can humanity ever truly control desire? Or in every age and every society, do we always find ways to break through the walls of prohibition? The answer, perhaps, lies within history itself. For no matter how far back we look, the traces of desire are always there, sometimes cloaked in prayer, sometimes in the shadow of taboo, sometimes hidden within the strangest of rituals. And this is why the story of medieval sexuality is not only the story of the past, it is also the story of us today.